gentleman's question was really the relation of science and spirituality, and can science prove it to some degree? And so let me just say that part of what in almost all my books, what I end up doing is there's usually an initial chapter or two that goes into definitions, like what do you mean by science and what do you mean by spirituality? And what you find is there's always 2 or 3 or 4 different meanings, and that these questions change once you point to what meaning are you talking about. So I talk about at least 2 different types of science. And what we sometimes call them narrow science and broad science, or narrow science and deep science, or something like that. And there's sort of a general understanding that this is allowed. But if you look at the actual components of science, there are at least 3, and I call them the 3 wings of knowledge, the 3 wings of science. And it's not that you simply stumble around, see something, and go, oh, there it is, I've given it scientific proof. Science is a very, very specific kind of interpretive process. And it has 3 wings. And there are 3 very, very famous schools of epistemology, all of which have tried to claim that they've got it covered, but all of which are talking about one very important part. The first is an injunction. And it's always in the form something like this. If you want to know this, you must do this. So if you want to, it's raining outside. If you want to know if it's raining outside, go to the window and look. Cell has a nucleus. That seems like an obvious sort of statement to us. We didn't know that until a few hundred years ago. If you want to know whether a cell has a nucleus, 1, get a microscope. That is to say, build one. That took us 1,000,000 years to do. 2, learn how to stain a cell. 3, learn how to look down a microscope. Most people look down a microscope. They can't make sense out of anything they see. So if you want to know this, you must do this. Now that injunction, the original meaning of Thomas Kuhn's paradigm was an injunction. It wasn't a theory. And all he was saying is that scientific knowledge isn't lying around out there. It's paradigm dependent. Now, paradigm doesn't mean some theory that I can make up. It means you have to come up with an injunction that brings forth the data. And he used things like an X-ray or a battery. People never think a battery is a paradigm. Yes, the way Thomas Kuhn used it, that's exactly right. So for us, a microscope would be one. And every time you discovered a new type of injunction, you could bring forth new phenomena. Now, in a minute, I'll show you exactly why Zazen is an injunction. So meditation can be science in a broad sense. We'll come back to that in a minute. Because it very specifically fits exactly the definition of the injunction. But once you follow the injunction, then there's something called an illumination or a data or an experience. Look through the telescope, you'll have an experience. That experience, William James said, technically is called datum or data. And it really just means experience, the experience that shows up when I follow the injunction. There's a very important point to that. If you don't follow the injunction, you won't have the experience. If you don't look through Galileo's telescope, you're not going to see the moons of Jupiter. Third is some form of confirmation. I look through this telescope, I see what I think are 4 things going around Jupiter. You look through it and tell me what you see. So the third wing is confirmation, but most clever version of confirmation is Karl Popper's falsifiability. So he said a hypothesis isn't scientific unless you can think of some way that you can falsify it. Because otherwise, we have no way of telling. You can just say whatever you want, and nobody can get at it, and it might be a hunch, metaphysics, philosophy, but it's not science. So each of those 3 wings have had a school of epistemology that have said they're the most important. The first is the paradigm people. The second are empiricists that say there is an experience, and it has to have an experiential grounding. And the third are the Poppers that say it has to be falsifiable. Now, those 3 strands of good knowledge can be applied to any domain. It doesn't have to be applied just to rocks. I have something in my hand called Hamlet. It's written by, Willie Shakespeare guy. Made a fortune on literature. So here's Hamlet. You want to say, what's the meaning of Hamlet? You have to follow those same 3 strands. First of all, you have to read it. There's an injunction. You have to follow an injunction to get into the data domain. Once it's in there, you're going to have an experience. Hamlet did this, Hamlet did that, and then you're going to start to say what that is. Then you're going to check it with somebody else. And there are ways to fault. There's no one right interpretation of Hamlet, but there are 1,000,000 wrong ones. Hamlet is not about a picnic in Hawaii. That's false. Well, I just applied all 3 strands of science to any form of knowledge. Zen, meditation, the same thing. There are all three strands. And if you meet all three strands, you've passed all three empirical tests or epistemological tests for good knowledge. One is, if you want to know if there's Buddha nature, start counting your breath. Do that for 5 years. And get back to me. But there's an injunction. You have to train the instrument. Once you follow that injunction, you'll have an illumination. You'll have an experience. You'll have a satori. You'll have a kensho. You'll have some form of experience. Then check it with a community of the adequate. The community of the adequate means people that have done number 1 and number 2. If you haven't looked through Galileo's telescope, you're not allowed to vote on whether Jupiter has moons or not. If you haven't learned geometry, you are not allowed to vote on the Pythagorean theorem. And nobody expects you to be allowed to vote. It's not a democracy here. Same is true for mystical knowledge, contemplative knowledge. It's not out there, but it follows all three strands. Okay? So the difference between deep science and narrow science is, for some reason that is very, very complex, there's always been a group of people that said, we're only going to apply those three strands to something I can see with my senses out here. Now, there's no reason to do that. First of all, that assumption doesn't follow the three strands. So they just made that up, and according to Popper, that's just bullshit metaphysics. That's dogma. That's not. So that's that. So what we do is we say we can put those together, because narrow science, meaning science of the gross objects, shows us the right-hand quadrants. And deep science shows us the interiors. And we try to say a couple of things. One, don't mistake findings of the right hand as if they prove the interior, because they don't. They just, in that sense, they're different. They're all interrelated, but they're different. You can't prove the meaning of Hamlet by quoting quantum mechanic laws. It just doesn't work. But they're correlated in the sense that every exterior has an interior event. So just like we were saying, if you're going into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, it will leave a distinctive fingerprint in the brain in the upper right. So it gives us a way to do what we call simultrack. We can use narrow science and deep science to prove the existence of phenomena that we can then correlate. And that's really kind of a summary of what integral methodology does. And that's why it does allow us to prove the existence of phenomena in the upper right, the lower right, the upper left, the lower left, and then hook them all together in ways that start to make sense. Okay? Is that kind of a... Okay. Was that... No, nobody fell asleep. I'm so happy.